Welcome to my channel HFY Epic Narratives. Don't forget to like and subscribe. They called the desert a wound the way some people called a city a promise. On Seryth Prime the wind stitched salt into every seam, and twin suns burned like two stubborn truths. Out on the Kalis Reach frontier, the colonists had learned to read ruin the way devout people read scripture as a map that told you how to survive. Marek Hollis had never been devout. He was an engineer, a man who talked to broken things until they sang again. When his rover's suspension tore through a hidden crevice and the comms died, he had one plan: tether the hull, wait for salvage, stay alive until someone with a real toolbox arrived. He had never expected the thing half buried in the dunes. The pod looked like a seed, a living steel husk cracked open by the same wind that peeled paint off the colony's water tanks. Its skin had the iridescence of an insect and the scars of a battle. Marek knelt beside it, fingers brushing the scorched metal like a man checking a wound for a pulse. The badge on the outer plating, a crescent beneath three dots, was scorched black, edges fused to the shell. He touched it with the pad of his thumb. Heat lingered there despite the cooling dusk. He didn't notice at first how the air changed. Sound thinned, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the pod sighed, hydraulics protesting, and a panel slid aside. A face came out, not human. An oval shell of bone needle and soft, dark membrane, eyes multifacted and deep as a drowned canyon. When she looked at him, she didn't see a man and a scavenger. She catalogued him: open hands, an unholstered wrench, a racing heart. Her uniform described rank and angles he had never seen, and on her breast, beneath charred resin, a patch he could decipher only by gut: Commander. She lifted a hand, fingers spread like a benediction, and Marek felt the world tilt. The commander who crawled out of the pod was smaller than human legend painted them, no mythic queen from Hollowops, only a woman who smelled of ozone and singed feathers and the raw, intimate terror of someone alive when she had been supposed to be dead. She was T'sala Veyu of the Andrium fleet. He would learn that later. In that hour, with sand tattling in the pod's open seams, she looked at him the way someone might look at a stranger who had come to ease a wound or steal a name. "Don't move," she said, the syllables audible, translated through the pod's worn interface that still spat out thin notes of broken English. Her voice had edges. Not cruel, alert, curious, carrying the soft warmth of someone trying to remember a word just out of reach. He couldn't help himself. He laughed, a nervous sound that tasted like the dust around his teeth. "You should say that more often," he said. "Works miracles with old rovers." She blinked a way that made her spines rattle like chimes. "Your humor is oddly adaptive," she said. "Why do you stand here when you could leave?" "Leave?" He jabbed a thumb at the horizon where the silhouette of Navali outpost smoked like a dull promise. "Where to? Besides, you look like you need someone with hands who doesn't scream when circuits bleed." Her thin lips quirked into what Marek later swore was the smallest surrender of a smile. They did not trust each other. Not yet. There was mistrust in the way she watched his hands. There was suspicion in the way he measured her strength by the loosened grip on that scorched badge. On a world stitched together by transience and treaties, both had good reasons. He belonged to a species that had colonized the cluster aggressively enough to leave a taste of resentment on many tongues. She belonged to a fleet that had known the metallic intimacy of explosions and betrayal. She still wore the scent. The first night under Seryth's twin suns, Marek set up a shelter just out of sight of the pod as if proximity might keep the cold from swallowing them both. He had a field tent and refugee rations, cheapest government issue, and a small fire that made shadows look like they were remembering to be monstrous. T'sala watched him from the pod in flickers, as much a study as a sentinel. Her biosuit, intact but sparking, hummed like a heart on borrowed time. The flickering biosuit became their unspoken language. When it breathed steady, she could stand upright and patch the pod. When it shuddered, she sat and sang into the alloy like a child soothing a small animal. Marek learned the rhythm of it, the occasional stutter, the way it coughed out scent of ionized lavender when the filters passed a scrub. He offered her a thermal blanket once. She accepted it with a formal nod, fingers light as papyrus on his forearm. You are alone? Marek asked at some point because questions held the power to create evidence. Not alone, she corrected. Separated. There are others. I was making a course for the Veyu cohort when she gestured at the scarred hull with a sweep of her hand that told a story in emotion. The fight was close. I do not know what happened to the rest. He thought about calling the outpost for a rescue but didn't. The comrades were down in the storm-heated valley between sand mangrove ridges, and besides, rescue would bring soldiers with clipped questions and bright lights that turned people into suspects. Neither of them had much taste for suspicion that hummed like a blade. The distrust hardened when a scout from Navali arrived at dawn, a local with a stare like a hawk and an appetite for profit. He eyed the pod like a man queuing for a prize. Marek's hand twitched toward his wrench. The scout wanted salvage rights, a bargaining framed as law. T'sala stepped from the pod with slow, deliberate grace, and Marek heard the soft, cheap synth of her armor as if an orchestra warmed a single instrument. You must leave, she said. This vessel is sovereign. Nice language, the scout said. He laughed and offered coin like a bribe with a hand that smelled of motor oil. Sovereigns don't show up in sand like this. They do when they are lost, T'sala replied, voice low, dangerous with a kind of elegant anger Marek had only seen in men facing bureaucrats. She raised the scorched steel badge on her chest and Marek felt, in spite of everything, his throat tighten. The badge had been melted and blistered. Despite that, it held a story of rank and courage and something burned into metal like a vow. The scout withdrew. He needed easier markets and less complicated miracles. When he was gone, Marek realized T'sala had watched him leave with an intensity that read like gratitude and something fiercer, fear for what rescue might bring. She was not naive. She was not easily saved. She had a fleet that would send hunters for her scrap or negotiators to pull electrodes of power from her life. They sat by the dying fire and shared a can of reconstituted soup. T'sala had questions that came as fragments, terms of tact that suggested she had once believed in clear laws and alliances. Marek told her about Navali's brokered peace, about buffer zones, about the way survival had become a business. He told her about his sister, once a poet, now a maintenance foreman who kept the outpost from collapsing, and he lied by omission about how often he feared being so small in the world. Why did you help me? She asked when the soup was gone. Because your biosuit was coughing, Marek said. And because I can fix things. And because anyone who can look that mad the way you do deserves someone to put a patch on. She laughed, a clear cut that sounded like rain on metal. You are human, Marek Hollis. Humans fix because they fear otherwise what will be left. The name she gave him, her first admission to knowing it, made the desert expand into a place with history. Marek swallowed. Sometimes trust was a thing that began in the sharing of names. They did not become friends overnight. Distrust is a slow metronome, it keeps a measure. But there were fissures of curiosity. Each watched the other and found room to be more than the sum of suspicion. T'sala's broken AI pendant hung from a ribbon at her neck, its casing cracked and its algorithm stuttering in short bursts of muffled song. Marek touched it once, reverently, and felt the tiny pulse of a voice that had once been an advisor, now half-dead and full of memory. It used to tell me the safest course, she said. It remembers star charts. It tries to remember faces. Mine used to tell me when to sleep, Marek said, and they both laughed because humor is a thin thing that keeps you from bleeding out. Trust is not a switch, it is a series of small acts purchased with risk. The first purchase cost nothing, a task traded for a story. Marek taught T'sala how to splice a fuse with cabling adapted from rover guts. She taught him how to move without the human tendency to interview the world with panic, how to listen for the sound of sand before it rises, how to read the sky when storms remembered to be polite. The flickering biosuit stabilized in the span of a week. Marek stripped and rewired a secondary power supply, braided its filaments into a more human-tolerant architecture. Sometimes he plugged his tools into the suit and watched the way it accepted life like a creature nudged awake. The AI pendant cracked open like a secret when he fed it a scavenged codec, It spat partial stanzas of lullabies and calculations for gravity wells and, once, a childish poem about twin suns and stubborn planets trying not to fall into the dark. You patched a life with Roadrunner wire in the same stubbornness my sister shows patching poems into plumbing, T'sala told him one night while they sat under the pod's warped shadow. Above them, the stars hammered their own slow, patient rhythm. You could say I do both, Marek replied, and the joke lived in his eyes more than his words. She knew how to read that look. A softness bloomed in the space between them, not exactly trust, but a common ledger of favors. The desert was not kind. A plasma storm smoked the horizon, a smear of violet that moved like a living bruise. They sheltered under the torn wing of a derelict freighter, just the two of them and a handful of flattened cargo bays. The storm cracked the sky into teeth and made the light behave like a liar, promising refuge and delivering a cacophony of hunger. Trapped under metal, they found that language can be more intimate when it is small. T'sala told a story in clipped phrases of a world where stars went quiet when the soldiers came through, and how her commander had once learned to fold himself into prayer. Marek offered the simple confession that he was afraid of being inconsequential. I am afraid of making small things that are only temporary, he said, voice flattened with fatigue. I once fixed a clock in the outpost that my neighbor swore was cursed. It kept his family's birthdays from getting forgotten. I thought it was nothing. He cried. I still don't know what I fixed. T'sala's fingers found the scorched steel badge he had wrapped carefully in cloth. Her touch lingered on the silver where black had pocked it. You make small miracles. That is a kind of power humans have, to persist in ordinary kindness. That's a noble way to frame shoveling sand out of filters, he said, but his laugh was honest, an exhale in a cramped, dangerous world. In the belly of the wreck, the bond between them tightened. Danger focuses attention with merciless grace. In the dark, the broken AI pendant whispered fragments of an old lullaby and translated them into probabilities for safe passage. It stuttered phrases in T'sala's language, then coughed up Marek's name like a talisman, Marek Hollis. Hearing his name spoken in a voice that belonged in circuits made Marek feel like a relic reclaimed. You're not supposed to be named by machines anymore, T'sala said softly. Maybe machines remember us better, Marek said. Maybe we forget. The closeness mutated from instrument to intimacy. Marek watched the way T'sala bared her throat when she slept and the way her eyes thundered in the dark. She learned to trust his hands and to cry without armor when the storm hammered patience into them both. They shared days of silence and nights of whispered plans. Respect grew not as doctrine but as muscle, flexed through necessity and eased by the steady rhythm of shared survival. They both misread each other sometimes. Once, during a foray to siphon coolant from a derelict rover, Marek watched T'sala refuse to take a gun from his belt. I can carry it, he offered. I do not take instruments of killing unless there is no other choice, she said. But I will learn to wield one if it will keep us breathing. He held the gun instead, feeling foolish and proud like a man guarding a promise. Later, when a scavenger band crested a dune and tried to jump them for parts, it mattered that they held different codes. Marek shouted and the gun barked and T'sala used words that were swords, crisp imperatives in NDRI. They moved in a pattern the outpost had never seen, an engineer and a commander sharing a choreography of protection. Afterward, with adrenaline ebbing and the sand yielding tiny, filthy flowers, they laughed and then they did not. Their eyes met in the way soldiers do when they have been named by danger and have survived it together. I thought you were a myth, Marek confessed in the after hours, the sentence small and alive. People tell tales about commanders who eat comets for breakfast. I thought humans were loud and dangerous and impossible to hold in one memory, T'sala answered, smiling through the burn of fatigue. You are not. You are, often louder, yes. But you keep small things. You keep clocks. Those admissions are seeds. They grow into something neither wholly planned nor entirely accidental. When rescue finally came, it was not from the outpost or the fleet. It arrived as a shockwave, an incoming frigate punching thin the silence and dropping a storm of drones that painted the sky like a swarm of black petals. It was the Andrium strike group, late and terrible, engines howling forgiveness in the only way they knew how. T'sala stared. Marek's wrench was still clutched in his calloused hand. "They came for you," he said. He expected relief, the kind that evaporates pride into gratitude. She did not feel relief. The frigate carried not only rescuers, for a rescue was also an arrest and a reckoning. Where the fleet's ships went, explanations followed. Wars had been fought over the loosened line between hunter and helper. "They come with their flags," T'sala said. "They come with the right to reclaim what belongs to the fleet. They will lock you into questions you did not ask." Marek felt small under the weight of that. "We could explain," he offered. "We could tell them what happened here." "Explanation is a currency," T'sala said, and Marek saw it in the edge of her jaw. "They pay with chains." They tried to hide. They tried to speak in circuits and gestures. The broken AI pendant flickered with a stubborn glow, its core whispering antique coordinates and the name of a small lunar system they both knew but couldn't afford to mention. But the frigate patented a new horizon when it signaled with the etiquette of authority, offers of repatriation and bribes disguised as aid. Negotiation was not their plan. Neither of them wanted to become a price paid for honor. The commander had rank, he had obligations. Marek had loyalty, he had scars. The choice shaped itself in the space between them like a blade. On the day the fleet's officers disembarked, they brought with them a legalist with a voice like cold brass. He spoke diplomatic sentences that smelled faintly of old blood. T'sala listened for a long while, her hands folded so tightly at her sides that the joints of her fingers whitened. "You must come," the brass-voiced officer said. "There are allegations. You are implicated in raids throughout the Kalis Reach." T'sala closed her eyes. "I will go," she said finally. "But not yet." "Not yet?" "Not yet." She turned to Marek as if making a decision in front of a mirror. "I will not go today. I will leave when the safety of this place is assured." Marek could have been angry, he had been a man in a world that demanded his selfish preservation as a virtue. But when he looked at her, the choice had already set in, she would leave with or without his consent. She had rank and a past that was wider than any promise they could make under desert sky. He understood then that some debts could only be repaid with more than words. "Then we'll make a price they cannot collect," Marek said. "We'll make them remember what they are not allowed to take." T'sala's eyes narrowed, not in calculation but in admiration. "Your stubbornness is an instructive disease," she murmured. They worked like thieves in the night. The scorched steel badge, careful in Marek's toolbox, became a talisman of courage, a thing to hide should the fleet try to interrogate it. The damaged AI pendant, half-dead and brave, hummed encouragements in pixelated lullabies. The flickering biosuit was given a last-ditch patch and oxygen buffer that Marek jury-rigged using the outpost's old life support scrap and a handful of his own blood-sweat lessons. The fleet began to act in small tyrannies. They arrested, they took inventory, they asked questions with the subtlety of a blade asking for a vein. The outpost's broker pressed for access to the pod, eyes glittering like someone hunting the carcass for jewelry. Marek and T'sala kept their heads down, acting like two people who had nothing to hide, and the soldiers who came to take them were given nothing but faces that refused drama. It crumbled anyway. The strike group decided that the pod's data architecture might contain proof of a larger raid and ordered the outpost to hand everything over. The villagers were frightened. The broker grew greedy and influential, and 2 nights later, an ultimatum arrived: surrender the commander, or face a requisition that would leave Navali empty and begging. The ultimatum felt like a shiv. The outpost leaders considered the calculus, the lives of many against the life of one. They were, in every sense, reasonable. Marek's heart bled at their boardroom's decisions because he knew reasonable decisions, in war, become brutal. T'sala refused to be the coin on which their survival was bought. She gathered the outpost's elders with a calm that was the mouthpiece of a storm. "You may fear the fleet more than you fear your own choices," she told them. You may prefer to keep all of you by laying this one across the altar. But if you give us to them, you lose what you value most, the mercy to decide for yourself. No one wanted war. Navali did not want to be a battlefield. But when the broker proposed handing T'sala over in exchange for supplies, a thing shifted. Marek felt the room tilt like a ship in a half-thought prayer. He thought of the clock he had fixed, the neighbor's face when it worked. He thought of what mercy tasted like, a mixture of iron and plain bread. He thought of T'sala's steady hands and the way she had, unknowingly, fixed something inside him that had been rusted for years. The final night arrived with a sky that didn't feel like mercy. Marek sat on the edge of a dune, the scorched steel badge heavy in his palm. T'sala came to sit beside him, no translator this time, only the soft, shared silence of two people who had become scarce in a world of rationed feelings. "You could leave," she said, voice low like a sea that had learned to be careful around reefs. "You do not owe me anything." He laughed once and the sound was small. "I owe you the truth," he said. "I owe someone the thing I can give best." She tilted her head. "And what is that?" "You told me humans keep small things," he said. "I keep things honest. I keep things alive. I keep promises. I will not let them take you for the price of their food." Her biosuit stuttered. Marek could see the flicker of light beneath her ribs like a small ship on a dark sea. "You are most compassionate in the most inconvenient ways," she said. "It would be nicer if you were less annoying." "If it makes you feel better," he replied, "I'll be as annoying as the universe needs." They made a plan that night that smelled of desperation but also a clarity that belonged to people who had long ago decided to be honest. Marek would present himself as the guilty party. He would claim the pod as his work. He would say that the commander was a refugee he sheltered, a human ally who opposed fleet policies. He would say what he needed to make Navali's leaders feel safe enough to deny the fleet's requisition. It was theater. It was also a confession. In the whispers of their exchange, in the way they prepared for something final, the intimacy between them sharpened. The broken AI pendant pressed against T'sala's chest like a secret. The biosuit hummed a lullaby that Marek learned like a prayer. The scorched badge lay between them, an emblem both fragile and furious. On the day they executed the plan, Marek put on a face as easy as rust. He stood before the fleet, voice steady, and confessed to fabricated crimes, hauling illegal salvage, conspiring with pirates to smuggle intelligence. He took the anger so that T'sala might be left intact. He let them manacle him in a way that made his palms bleed in quiet arcs. "Why are you doing this?" T'sala asked when the brass-voiced officer came to take him. Her voice had a split in it, a place where pity and fury fought. He looked at her with a courage that was not born of denial but of love. "Because someone saved me from the law of ordinary silence," he said. "Because you taught me how to keep what matters." Her eyes shone. She leaned forward and pressed a hand to his forehead, not a ceremonial touch, but something braver, a human gesture that was also alien, the cross-cultural anatomy of respect. "You are reckless," she said. "You are foolish." "You taught me how to be brave," he answered, and his laugh was a thin, astonished thing. "And how to fix clocks." Soldiers marched him away and the world tightened to a point. He felt the scratched ring of the manacles like a compliment. As his boots hit the ship's ramp, he heard a voice like a song in a memory, the broken AI pendant, singing Marek's name. It was a small, ridiculous comfort. Imprisonment can be its own kind of intimacy. Marek's cell was a small dark womb of metal and cold. He had time for one thing, to consider whether his sacrifice mattered. He remembered faces in the outpost who had taught him to be small and brave. He thought of the clock again. He thought of T'sala standing at the edge of the dune as the fleet's officers argued about logistics and law. They argued like bureaucrats. The commanders, for all their formalities, had lines they refused to cross. The brass-voiced officer, in private, found a face to bargain with. He liked the idea of taking home a trophy. He liked the calculation that the fleet would be appeased, and that peace would be brokered. He did not like surprises. T'sala, however, had a plan that was not lit by politics. She had learned something from Marek about the smallness of mercy, that it is a thing you insist upon and never ask permission for. She walked to the brass-voiced officer and did something that had no precedent in the kind of strategy manuals they printed for the fleet. She offered herself. "Take me instead," she said. "I am the commander. I will answer for all charges." There was a silence like a universe waiting to see which equation would hold. The officer's face, trained to process numbers like small men, flickered. Policy said commanders were judged by their fleet. Policy said one life was tolerable. Policy did not account for humans who fixed clocks or for the way compassion could rearrange a room. Why? The officer asked. It was not a question seeking a moral case but a procedural explanation. Because the lives saved in Navali matter as much as our dock space, she said. Because I would rather stand with them than take them as a bargaining chip. Marek realized, from his cell, that bravery had taken on a costume he could not have designed. He thought of the badge gleaming with its old defiance. He thought of the pendant and the way it hummed for him. He felt the absurd, delicious hope that T'sala's sacrifice might be different than the ledger-book logic of the fleet. They took her. They marched her with a dignity so quiet it was almost defiance. Before she left, she came to Marek's cell and stood within arm's reach, close enough that he could read the staccato of breath beneath her ribs. The biosuit flickered like a candle in wind. Her scorched steel badge shone. "Take care of the small things," she said. "Keep them honest." He reached out and touched her hand, the gesture of two creatures from different worlds meeting at the axis of grief. Her fingers were cool beneath the armor. His palm, rough with work, left a smear of oil on her shell, a human signature. "I promised," he said. "I keep promises with hands. I will keep yours." She smiled, widening a small abrasion across her face that Marek realized was more human than anything he had seen. "Then go fix what must be fixed," she told him. "Leave behind the world you can heal. Let that be your confession." It was a strange blessing and 100 kinds of pain. He watched her go and felt a universe unclench. Climax, confession under the ash of imminent death. Weeks later, the fleet's politics shifted like a tide. Someone always found profit in the misery of borders. Negotiations went sideways. The fleet declared a smaller shuttle patrol to secure Navali during investigation. The outpost council panicked and squeezed the broker for good sense. The storm that rearranged everything, cosmic, political and otherwise, came as a technical cascade. A weapon previously quarantined in an Atlas-class cruiser activated due to a fault in the fleet's maintenance logs. It was the kind of bureaucratic error that had consequences measured in stars. The malfunction was quiet at first, an error code flitting across the fleet's dashboard like a moth trying to navigate a hurricane. Then it mapped a trajectory and bent toward Seryth Prime. Marek heard about the incoming device as if the night itself were a rumor. He ran toward the open sky like someone returning to an old truth. T'sala's convoy was being escorted back for a hearing, the badge on her chest whispering stubborn defiance. The fleet could not have known, or maybe they did and did not care. An ancient outlawed weapon was a bureaucrat's nightmare. "That's a civilian strike radius," Marek said to the officer who briefed him. "You can't." "It is an old ordnance," the officer replied. "It will not detonate completely." "It will," Marek said. "And even if it's a controlled discharge, it will take everything within 40 kilometers. That's Navali." They argued with the kind of language that made Marek's blood feel like slow-moving oil. There were legalistic pauses, mentions of jurisdiction and precedents. Marek walked to the edge of the shipyard and found a view of the horizon, where the sky had started to burn like a bruise. The twin suns hung low, their light picking out a wet sheen of panic in people's faces. You do not bargain with the ticking sky, you bargain with the people beneath it. Marek ran. He broke every protocol he had ever been taught like a man building a ladder out of the pages of his life. He arrived at the docking bay where T'sala's shuttle sat, waiting. Soldiers lined the path, bored, waiting for a verdict that had nothing to do with mercy. He pushed past them and burst into the shuttle's interior. T'sala was strapped into a chair, calm as a sundial. The broken AI pendant lay on her lap like an ember. Her badge was pinned to the wall like a small fury. "I came to stop them," Marek said without greeting. "They will not stop themselves," she said. "Why are you here?" "Because I keep promises with hands," he said again, and then because there was no other truth he could offer. "And because I refuse to be a man who watches others pay a price for peace." She looked at him as if reading the inside of a lock. "You would risk everything." "I already did risk everything," he told her. "I just haven't finished paying attention long enough to see what else needs saving." Outside, the sky folded itself into a bruise of warning. The weapon arced through space like a star that had decided to forget where it belonged. There was no time for plans that required permission. There was time only for decisions that arrived like a hammer. On the decision, they hung their lives. T'sala had artillery training. Marek had a habit of disassembling things until they confessed their weak points. Together, they gambled on a maneuver with the audacity of people who had discovered that courage was cheap when the currency was denial. They commandeered the shuttle. With a clumsy choreography of hands, circuits and whispered commands, Marek crouched by the engine cavity and pried open the maintenance port with a borrowed tool. T'sala took the stick and pulled the craft into a trajectory that would, if they were lucky, intersect the weapon's path at the right angle, a kiss of metal meant to shepherd a terrible object toward a place where it might do the least harm. The plan had holes as big as God's. It had the kind of risk that smells like bravery or stupidity depending on who tells the story later. They made their calculations in the glow of the flickering biosuit and the half-singing of the broken AI pendant. Marek wrapped his hands around the core of the shuttle and felt the vibrations of a small machine that might be their only chance. "You're sure?" he asked. T'sala smiled, an expression that now carried the freight of shared nights and small betrayals turned into intimacy. "Are you?" "I have never been more sure," Marek said. "But if we fail, tell my sister I was proud of the clocks." She leaned close and kissed him on the forehead, a gesture that was not in any manual but that held more intimacy than any written clause. "Then make this a good 12 minutes of being alive," she said. They locked doors and set beams like a couple of engineers rigging a final play. The shuttle lifted and arced toward the weapon, a small human-made thing staring down the maw of annihilation. The hull sang, the radio complained, and the pandemic of stars looked on. They collided with an almost tender brutality. The weapon, old and grotesquely efficient, spat a storm of light. The shuttle took the brunt in a way that made metal scream and souls narrate their own eulogies. Marek held onto the core as if holding onto a child who was crying. T'sala piloted with the precision of someone trying to thread a needle through an animal's heart. The impact was a cathedral of noise. For a heartbeat stretched thin into an unlit eternity, everything was a single sense: the sound of metal like bones breaking, the taste of ozone in the mouth, the smell of burning badge, the cry of a pendant as it burned through memory into song. In the last seconds, the shuttle rotated in a way that mattered. It directed the blast away from the valley, away from the outpost's thin houses and the clock Marek's neighbor had once treasured. The weapon's energy fulminated into empty sky and not into human bodies. They had bought time with the currency of their lives. Marek felt the shock ripple through him, then recoil, then spread. He took in the world and found T'sala beside him, chest heaving in a rhythm that matched the biosuit's pulse. They were both scorched in a way that was not only physical. The scorched steel badge had bent but held. The broken AI pendant had gone still in his hand, its last whisper an encrypted lullaby. They had become someone else's story before they could solidify their own. They hovered between breath and not breath. Under the twin suns, as the dust settled and the world rebalanced its geometry, T'sala looked at Marek with an expression that made his entire inventory of small defenses collapse. She touched his face with fingers that had once directed fleets. Her hand shook in a way that told him she had never been this vulnerable. "You could have left me," she said, voice a chord that held the texture of astonishment. "I could have," Marek answered. "But I didn't." He stopped because the sentence that followed was bigger than any of the sentences he'd had the right to. He pulled the scorched badge from his chest where he'd secretly worn it for protection. He placed it in her hand. "Keep this," he said. "It means you were brave." She weighed the badge in her palm and then placed it against his heart. "You kept me," she said. "You kept the small things. You kept me alive." The confessing came like a release. T'sala had been conditioned by fleets and duty to speak in protocols. Marek had been taught by life to be small and stubborn. In the final intimacy, under the threat of collapse, they gave each other truths they had not yet spent. "I'm afraid," she murmured, a whisper laden with the vulnerability of someone who had commanded fleets but never been certain of the smallness of her own courage. "I am afraid of not being more than a badge burned into a memory." He laughed, thin and luminous. "I'm afraid of being a man who fixes things for other people and forgets to fix himself," he said. "But maybe fixing you fixed me." T'sala leaned in. Their foreheads met like two halves of a planet finding a moon. The closeness was electric and intimate in a way that left neither of them speechless but both of them searching for words that mattered. "Marek," she breathed. She placed her forehead against his and for a moment the universe narrowed to the small pool of light between them. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll keep the clocks running. Promise me you'll keep the small things for the many and the few." He kissed her, gentle, a thief stealing the last words from a dying room. "I promise," he whispered. She rested her hand on his face, the touch as profound as prayer. It was an intimacy that wore no banners, no ideologies. It was a plain human promise held in the bones of a commander whose life had been defined by orders. He thought he saw stars folding like a badge in her eyes. The world shook in a language that either signaled death or a kind of rebirth. They chose to be brave in the way that bravery is often most beautiful, a private thing. He pressed the broken AI pendant into her palm. It was warm and heavy with history. "Take it," he said. "Let it remember us when we cannot." She took it and tucked it beneath the scorched badge. "Then we will both be proof," she said. "Proof that small mercies are not irrelevant." Their clasp was a map of the world they'd been given, flawed, precarious and incandescent. Sacrifice cut both ways. The shuttle did not survive, the weapon did not complete its arc. The outpost lived. The fleet deferred judgment out of equal parts guilt and fear. T'sala was found among wreckage and dragged to a hearing where the laws were instruments and mercy was an anomaly. But she was alive, and that mattered above ledger books. Epilogue, Transcendence and Legacy. In the months that followed, Nivali healed in the peculiar way colonies do, slowly, with stitches and gossip and the patient labor of those who cannot afford to wait for miracles. Marek returned to his workbench as if returning from a pilgrimage. He fixed pumps and patched filters. He kept the clock that had once belonged to his neighbor and added an extra hammer to the toolkit. He learned to be less romantic about the grand gestures of war and more lyrical about the small ones, changing filters, mending the rust that could rot an entire community. He became something larger by staying small. T'sala's trial was elongated and messy. The fleet's hierarchies were only sensitive to shame when the press began to tell the story of the commander who had refused to be a bargaining chip. There were hearings. There were protests. There were human and Andriam faces on both sides, and in the middle of it all, the scorched steel badge clung to the narrative. In a quieter corner of the hearings, where the light settled with a forgiving dusk, Marek stood and told a plain human story about a clockmaker. He did not ask for absolution, he asked the kind of question that made bureaucrats flinch: what kind of ruling does a people deserve that cannot tolerate the mercy of their neighbors? T'sala listened from her counsel, the broken AI pendant tucked beneath the scorched badge against her chest, its small lamp flickering like a heartbeat. When the verdict finally came, it was less a victory than a recalibration. T'sala was reprimanded for a breach of protocol but allowed to return to her unit as an officer without chains. The fleet had, in a way Marek liked to remind himself smelled suspiciously like a reluctant parent, learned that the currency of respect is not victory but earned dignity. They did not confess love in public hearings. They did not need to. In the quiet months after, Marek and T'sala met in the outpost's field where the twin suns made the sand glow like slow gold. They would walk, sometimes without speaking, and share the small intimacies of people who have been given second chances, the exchange of tools, the tasting of food that remembered other planets, the shared jokes about the absurdity of bureaucracy. Their bond deepened not because ideology drew them together but because compassion did. T'sala learned to admire Marek's stubborn insistence upon small mercies. Marek learned to respect the fierce tenderness under the commander's armor. They argued, they made peace, they shared bad jokes in languages that did not always translate. In private, T'sala taught him a method of warfare that was more art than science, how to steer a fleet through politics and not just planets. He taught her how to put a tiny spring back in a watch, to make the hours patient again. There were small rituals. Marek always polished the scorched steel badge with his father's old rag. T'sala wound the broken AI pendant in a small ceremony and whispered to it like a child reading to a bird. They kept the flickering biosuit warm in worst storms. They charged the pendant until it hummed like a contented memory. The last act of intimacy came when the outpost decided to name their small hall the Veyu Commons, a place where scavengers and scholars would sit side by side. Marek objected to the public display, feigning modesty, but T'sala insisted, and he relented because she had the kind of stubbornness that complemented his own. On the morning the plaque was unveiled, twin suns rose like two generous gods. The pendant, repaired to the extent human hands could coax old code back into life, glowed with a stubborn light beneath the plaque. People came with hands full of bread and apologies and small gifts. They put their hands on the scorched steel badge, touched the polish, and remembered the price of mercy. They stood together, Marek and T'sala, at the edge of the commons. The badge rested between them like a compass. The pendant pulsed faintly, and the biosuit, no longer a need but a chosen relic, hung in a place of honor. T'sala turned to him and smiled, a smile that had the weight of battles and the softness of shared soup. "You kept clocks," she said. "And you taught me how to command one," Marek replied. He held her hand in public this time, fingers threaded like circuits and oaths. They made no grand promises before the crowd. They didn't have to. Their intimacy had been forged under wilder suns. The world they built was not a monument to conquest but to attention, to the small acts that accumulate into legacies years later. In a field outside Nibali where the wind loved to rearrange fossils into new shapes, a child found the broken AI pendant tucked beneath a stone. It glowed, soft and stubborn, as if waking from a long sleep. The child held it up to the twin suns and the pendant's light flared like a small, defiant dawn. Under the sun's slow blessing, the pendant hummed a lullaby in a voice that did not belong to any single species, a song stitched from favors and promises and the odd machinery of mercy. It pulsed once, twice, and then, as if finishing the sentence that had been waiting the entire time, it whispered in a voice that carried the dust of two worlds. He did not fight to win, he fought to remind the stars what mercy looked like. The pendant blinked against the twin suns, and the world, for a breath, remembered how to be kind.